back on what I've learned through some of I do want to offer one disclaimer, and this is why I've always been hesitant to share my adoption story. It's not the complete story. I'm only giving part of the story. My children have a story as well, and they're in the middle of their story. People always say outside of the adoption community that even though adoption's a blessing, they don't really realize that it comes at a price, and that those who experience the price most intensely are our children. So I don't want to speak for my children, so I'm not going to share their story or their interpretations. But just remember, as I share their experiences, or me experiencing them, that they've experienced this loss from a completely different vantage point than we have. And I have an inadequate view of their experiences, so don't judge them. They're my babies. But here we go. So I've been told I need to be credible and personable by my husband. So first, I will be credible. I am a special ed teacher. I have a bachelor's degree in community service with a focus in sociology. I have an education specialist credential for students with moderate to severe learning disabilities, and I've been working in the field of social service for 19 years, and I believe this is the first time I've ever been asked to share my story. On the personal side, there's not much. I love to cook. My husband and I watch 90 reruns shows after the kids are asleep and eat See's candy. I hope to develop hobbies by the age of 50, and currently I just have a craft closet and a dusty piano. And that is because I am the mother of 8 children, and I have 0 fur babies. I have 4 adopted children, 1 stepchild, and 3 children that share my DNA, and I've been an adoptive mother for over 13 years. I don't know the exact moment I decided to adopt. My husband Matthew and I discussed adoption before we even got married. I remember the day after we got engaged, sitting at the Port of Olympia with my head on his shoulder, and we were talking about how we were going to have a huge family. We both wanted the first kids that we brought in our home to be adopted. We wanted all kinds of kids. We wanted regular kids, kids with disability. We wanted kids from different backgrounds. We wanted kids of different colors. And I was so excited to find someone who had that same passion as me, who cared more for others and his progeny, and we weren't completely naive to the struggles of children with traumatic beginnings. His brother was adopted in a few weeks after birth, and he struggled with violent outbursts, learning struggles, and troubles with the police. I had worked with foster care kids, and I was basically paid to be their friend. I would take them to the mall, to the park, and to the movies and just talk. And for a college kid, this was an awesome job, but it was also my first real glimpse into their lives, about how dark things could get for them. Many of the children I worked with had been taken from their parents not once, but multiple times, and lived in multiple foster care families. I learned at that time that the system that was supposed to help them was almost as broken as the families they were being rescued from. And I also saw how deeply the brokenness scarred these kids and how they would do anything to stop the pain. I had kids that would scream until blood flowed from their nose. They stole used cigarettes from public ashtrays. They would hurt other people, and they would cut on themselves. Matthew and I both knew this journey we would take would be hard, but not impossible. God had told me it was hard. A year before my engagement, during a chapel service at my Christian college campus, God had spoken to me. I had been praying he would speak to me. It was actually a challenge that they had given all the students at the college, that we were supposed to talk to God, to listen to him, and then let him speak to you. And one girl who was successful at this came up and she shared her testimony. And I'll never forget this. So she gets up there and she said she was unsure about Christ's love for her, but she decided to take this challenge, and she faithfully prayed that God would speak to her. And so she heard God talk to her, and he said, "Ask for anything, no matter how small or crazy, and I will give it to you." And she searched her heart, and she asked for a closet full of new clothes. And she didn't tell anyone about her request. And by God's grace, a woman showed up and bought her all new clothes. And so I thought, this is the best challenge. I'm going to go in. And I had been praying for weeks. I didn't really want new clothes, but I did want to hear God speak. The previous year, I had attempted to end my life, and I was continuing to struggle with depression and anxiety. And I felt his words would bring me the peace that I wanted. Above all, I wanted peace, and to be honest, peace has always been an idol for me. As the speaker was talking at this chapel service about the potter and his clay, the surroundings began to fade, and my heart became still. And the Lord said to me, Rebecca, you are going to go through a fire. I didn't want a fire. I'd rather have the clothes. I didn't want to hear that message. I wanted to hear, Rebecca, I love you. Rebecca, you're mine. Rebecca, have faith. But my message was not one of comfort, and so I burst into tears. And I'm sure it was very alarming for those who were sitting next to me, unaware of my encounter. But even though that message was ominous, it was precious to me, and I kept it close to my heart. As years passed and I didn't experience any peculiar or dramatic events, I came to believe that God spoke of the fire of raising kids from challenging beginnings, and I was ready. I was okay with this challenge. I was willing to walk through this fire. I knew it would hurt, I knew it would be difficult, and I knew the losses would be worth it. My husband and I would walk through this, and God would be glorified, and we would see wonderful fruits of the labor. I think most adoptive parents have had, if you're Christian, have had those thoughts. And then I met my children. We had been searching for a SIB set, which included a child with disabilities. I really wanted to adopt a special needs child. However, just after we started child search, I received a call. There was a sibling set of 3 that really needed a family. They had 2 failed adoptive placements, and we were the last couple in the area who were open to taking more than 2 children. And they didn't want to separate the children. We agreed to meet them, and I'll never forget seeing them for the first time. There were 2 girls and a boy, ages 5, 3, and 2. The youngest was a boy. He was 2, and he only weighed 21 pounds. He had stopped growing a few months after he was placed into foster care. They had 7 different places in the 1.5 years they were in care, and you could tell. The 5-year-old girl was their new mom. She reminded me of Reepicheep from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She was a mouse who considered herself as strong as a lion. However, her anger betrayed her, and it showed her inner fear. The second oldest was sweet and appeasing at 3, and she already understood that a smile protected her more than her strength. And she has kept that up, which is very nice for me. And the third was stoic and distrusting. He was aloof and as stubborn as any 2-year-old could be. And to be completely them. Time from assimilating into family life. And the second is that during our visits, they demonstrated some alarming behaviors. The level of anger was intense, and the oldest tried to run into the street, and the youngest was just too serious. And my previous experience working with students with who were emotionally disturbed, it just sent up some red flags. I didn't want to end up with children who struggled like my former students. Children who rage led them to do horrible things, such as mutilating their pets, or molesting their siblings, or pounding their face into the concrete. It was one thing to go and help these children during work hours and weekends, but it was another to raise them in your home. I mentioned these concerns to Matthew, and I will never forget his response. These are my children. I know we are supposed to adopt them. All right, who am I to argue? And I trusted God, and I trusted that God had gave him that confidence. My uncertainty was present when I went to pick them up. I'll never forget that. I had to pick them up from foster care placement, and I borrowed my parents' Subaru, which was a stick shift, and they were in Squaw Valley, so Squaw Valley is really windy, and I wasn't good with the stick shift. So as I was lurching down the hills in my car, there was a string of profanity flowing from the mouths of the children behind me. They asked me if I knew how to drive this effing car, and it was a very different experience than the adoption stories I had heard in my classes. I couldn't even make it all the way home. I stopped at Matthew's work. I asked him to drive the rest of the way home. I traded the Subaru for my Mustang, which was gone pretty soon after that. And I drove the rest of the way home in what would be the last moment of peace I had for a long time. However, when I got home, and this is like the amazing thing that I think happens with adoptive families. And the children have fallen asleep, and I carried them into their house for the first time. My commitment to them increased. They were mine. I felt the desire to protect them and provide for them well up in me, and I tucked them in bed for the first time. There were some really nice moments in the early days. Giggling during bath times, little hands slipping into mine, rocking children to sleep, picking out pretty dresses and doing art activities, getting that first kiss from a little boy who refused to smile, going to church for the first time, worshiping along your children, hearing a 5-year-old come up and tell you that they just found out there was a God and that he loves them, praying with them at night, listening to them as they use a broom, bucket, and old guitar to form their first backyard band. I really want to pause and give you some practical advice, especially if you're at the beginning of this, or maybe even now, I don't know. Take pictures of those little moments. Print them out. Don't even bother to frame them. Stick them up everywhere. Don't care if they get destroyed. Let the kids hold them, because Satan has a habit of turning those memories into a whisper. And trauma tends to scream out in our minds and drown out our daily triumphs. There were a lot of really hard moments, though, as well. Becoming a first-time parent is hard. Becoming a first-time parent of 3 scared children is very hard. Trying to step into the role of a mother for a child who already thought she was a mother was exhausting. There was tension between my eldest and me. She didn't want to let me parent, and my household couldn't be managed on the wisdom of a 5-year-old girl. This led to tensions that would erupt into power struggles over stupid things. Some of it was my fault, I'll be honest. How the sandwich was cut, what shirt she would wear, if she would or wouldn't brush her hair. I wavered between being able to handle these power struggles with God's grace and also responding in exhausted anger. There was yelling from both of us. I remember I grabbed a shirt one time and it ripped in 2. There were harsh words, which were not meant to grow the heart. I was trying to control behavior with shame and fear. I wasn't being the parent I wanted to be, and it was painful. But there was a more pressing problem, the youngest. He wasn't speaking much, but he was communicating plenty. Physically, he was starting to do better. He was gaining weight and developing an attachment for me. However, when we were at home, his meltdowns were horrific. When he was placed in a timeout in his playpen, he would throw himself onto the ground. Throw himself out of his playpen onto the ground on his head multiple times. He would scream and scream. When we stopped using the playpens for a while, we tried time ends. I don't know if any of you guys have tried time ends. I don't like time ends. Basically, what it is you basically wrap them in a blanket and you cuddle them until they give up. But what it felt to me was that it was a restraint until he passed out of exhaustion. I was told that this was normal. He was 2. He was just making a transition. If his speech was better, he would be able to communicate. Just give him time. Don't make demands. He just needs to know he's loved. But his rages came without warning. And I began to feel uncomfortable with time ins, so we did time out in his room. The adoption books said that isolating during difficult behaviors is not what you should do, but I didn't know what else to do. He would run into the door repeatedly until his face would bleed. I sought help and received mostly just simple parenting advice and minimization of my concerns. Just keep loving him. Love is enough to heal him. I knew in my heart something was off, but everyone was telling me I was wrong. When I say everyone, I'm talking about the professionals. There were problems with my marriage as well, and they were getting too big to ignore. We tried to buy a van, and I learned that my credit was low. We had tons of money in the bank. Apparently, we weren't making our car payments on time. My husband had told me he was paying the bills, but I found a mountain of mail, and it was mostly bills. I found out, and it didn't make sense because we could easily pay our bills. I found out we had 3 years of taxes that were never done. It's okay. I can fix this, I said. I'm a fixer. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And we ended up borrowing money from his parents for the van. I would take over the bills and the taxes so my husband wouldn't be overwhelmed while doing his credentialing program and substituting. And as soon as Matthew got a full-time job as a teacher, I became a stay-at-home mom. And to be fully devoted to this calling of adoption. And I'm really glad I did that. I have no regrets about that at all. It seemed to work. I had a job that I loved, but I was content with raising my children. Sacrificing a few years of my career was nothing in the scheme of my life and my children's. I began to deepen my roots in my community and fall more in love with God. I was a room mom. I watched the kids so my husband could minister at our church in the drama department. I was able to work through the long tantrums with my son with more patience. If I was available to meet everyone's needs, everything would be fine. I was losing weight. I was able to control more, and there was more peace. And my husband and I had more cuddling time, so I even got pregnant. This unplanned surprise was so exciting. I went to the first appointment, no heartbeat. Well, that's okay. They said it was still very early. Don't worry, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong. A few weeks later, there was bleeding. The miscarriage began, and the pain was unbearable, and I ended up needing a D&C. And I woke up, and my insides were burning. And I asked why. And the nurse told me it was from the tool they used to remove the... And her voice trailed off. I think that was probably one of the most painful moments because they didn't call it a child because it was too early, you know. What did I lose? Was it a child? Was it a clump of cells that didn't have a chance of surviving? Was it nothing? It was hard to express my grief, and I did, especially because I didn't even know what I lost. Was this my fire that God had talked about? Did God warn me years ago that I would literally have a fire in my room, cauterizing what I had hoped was new life? I was not okay with this fire. I dropped my head on the bed and said, "This is the worst day of my life." They sent me home with my husband and warned him I was at risk for hurting myself, and he did a horrible job of comforting me. This is an example of what not to do. I asked to watch a movie, so he turned on District 9. I don't know. It's a sci-fi horror film. And as they began cutting into the abdomen of a man on a table, it was too much, and I asked him to turn it off. And he agreed and left to finish watching the movie alone in another room. I asked him to read part of the book he was writing, but he declined, saying he didn't want his book attached to a moment like this. Tears continued to flow off and on, mostly in secret, but sometimes ugly crying at women's retreat. But I put on a brave face, and for the first time, this fire had stolen something more valuable than I thought I could lose. I survived and hung on to my faith. My husband grew more distant. I assumed it was because of the loss, and I grew closer to God, and he comforted my heart. As I pushed through my grief, my children began to get better. When my little boy was 5, he returned to smile to me for the first time. His behaviors were manageable, however, they were still intense. Matthew and I decided to begin the adoption process again. It was the perfect time to welcome a new member into our family. It was a time of new things. We were the founding members in a new church, this one. My faith, although scarred, was stronger than it had ever been, and my children were learning about God's love. I learned that life owes us nothing and can throw us anything. I had my family, the love of my husband, and a new appreciation for things I had that were not yet lost. The adoption process was easier the second time around, and we quickly became parents of a 2-year-old boy. He had a G-tube, and we were told he was developmentally delayed with a rough IQ of 51. He was a drug baby and one of 7 other siblings who were they're all still in foster care. His children had a better foster care story than my first 3. He was lucky enough to have committed care from his providers in the group home for medically fragile children, and so building attachment with him was much easier. I have to say, in this situation, he got better really fast. He lost his G-tube. His IQ went up to 71. That's for testing-wise. I'm sure it was always there. And everything was going well. My husband found a permanent position in a lovely small town, and I was going to get my master's now that my 3 older kids were in school. And I began to see the future I always longed for. I began to see peace. Then the furnace ignited again. Matthew told me he didn't believe in God. What? We met at a Bible study. One of your closest friends is a pastor. You're active in ministry. You witness the healing power of God daily with our children. You've prayed next to me every Sunday since we were married. We worship together. We live together. Our parents both showed us God. I know that you see God because he is everywhere. I think at this time the presence of the Lord really directed my heart. And I knew that Matthew was lying. Maybe he didn't believe in God, but that wasn't the issue. He was sinning. I knew he was bound by a secret, and he was running from his guilt. I felt the Spirit leading me to refuse the challenge about him. The Spirit led me not to challenge him about his lack of faith or his new faith in nothing. And that made him mad. He wanted me to leave. He began to try to goad me into arguments. I asked why he stopped believing. He told me about this science experiment where they put 2 cells in a petri tube, and they shook it and shook it and shook it, which is supposed to represent 1 million years of these cells like bumping into each other randomly, and that they had joined. And so when he saw that, he said, "Rebecca, you know what that means. Evolution is real, and there's no God." I looked at him and I told him, "Call me when that 2-celled organism has a working lung. Plus, we're never the kind of people who believed that the existence of evolution meant the lack of God's existence." When I refused to fight, he became more upset. He began to say mean and hurtful things. When we failed sexual encounters, it was because I was unattractive or clumsy. And the Holy Spirit was beginning to reveal to me what my heart that wanted peace always refused to see. I began to see his neglect, his hurtful words, and what I had overlooked for years. I had just assumed that I was too sensitive or too demanding. And I began to hear the dishonesty in his voice, and he began to change. And I remember he became so cruel, and he said, "Even if there is a God, Rebecca, he doesn't love you. Because if he did, he wouldn't let me do the things that I've done to you." Those words, "he doesn't love you," rang so loud in my ears. There were times that the walls of my room felt like they were getting closer and closer, and I had to run outside to catch my breath. I wasn't afraid of his lack of faith. I was afraid of what he had yet to confess. I felt one day to see him, and as soon as he was done teaching, I asked him to take a drive with me while the youngest napped in the back of the car. I reminded him that we had a family and a child who had just been in our care for 6 months. And I wanted to work on our issues, but we needed to be kind and we needed to be honest. I reminded him that I made a vow, and I intended to remain faithful to my vow as long as I could, and he seemed defeated. He looked at me and said, "I've been with other women." "Who? People we know?" "No." "What are their names?" "I don't know." "What do you mean?" "I found him online and we just met up and had sex." "How many?" "More than I can remember." "For how long?" 6 years. 6 years, and we had only been married 8. So before the children, yes. That moment still silences all other thoughts. That memory still silences all other thoughts when it occurs. I just parked the car, walked in and bought something at the store. I called Jason. I don't remember what he said, and I went back to the car. "How could you do this for 6 years? The fire was ignited. "I never told you because I knew you wouldn't leave," he smirked, once again attempting to blame me. "Oh, I'm leaving, and you're sleeping at a hotel." And I dropped him off at his school, and I drove home as my world came crashing down. I'm going to step off my storytelling box onto maybe a little bit of a preacher box at this moment. I feel like I've gained the right in some ways. But your secret sins destroy and consume you just as much, and if not more, than the ones that everyone sees. If you struggle with a sin that you think you have under control, if you promised yourself that you've done this or that for the last time, please take courage. Let God give you more than the shame you have in your life now. Stop allowing Satan any more room to grab hold of your family. Let people know. Let the people you sinned against know, because I promise you, I have seen it over and over again, even outside our marriage, that Satan is not content with keeping your destruction in the shadows, especially if you serve God. When I left Matthew, this isn't in my writing, I feel like the Lord gave me this phrase, and I turned in my email address, salt and exodus. If you look back, you're going to turn into salt, and I'm going to take you through an exodus. And sure did. I think it was the Spirit that helped me not look back. It was also that I was putting out 100 more fires. The flame spread, the children re-entered their traumatized state. My eldest lost all trust in me. I was supposed to keep her safe, and I didn't. I was supposed to be her forever family, and it wasn't. I was supposed to be strong, and I could hardly breathe. And I remember the first night in my apartment, I wept. This was not the life that I wanted. This was not okay. I had lawyers to visit, employment to find, an adoption as a single parent to complete, and a new relationship to define with a man who shared my children, but none of my trust. The rage of my children and myself was indescribable, and the one hurting the most was my oldest boy. He had nowhere to put his anger, so he put it everywhere. He tried to break the window of my car. He would scream and scream for hours. He would try to tear out our walls. He would try to hurt himself. I would have to restrain him until we were both covered in sweat. I called the crisis line. I don't know if it's better now, but back then it was horrible. Bring him in. We'll evaluate him. Bring him in? How can I operate a vehicle if I bring him in? So I would call the police. And when they arrived, he would be calm and stoic and barely responsive. I took him to therapy and a psychiatrist, and they all said the same thing. He is smart, maybe too smart. And then when my ex became less and less involved, my children's life, in my children's life, their rage grew. My son started to attack other children and was attempting to poison our food. Therapists recommended out-of-home placement in a locked facility, and I went with my sister and our other children to Reno. I told my son he was going to see a doctor, and I didn't tell him I was going to leave him there. When he realized he was not coming home with his family, he became like a wild animal, and he called for me over and over again. It took 2 adult men to pull this 7-year-old boy out of the room, and at the end it was too much, and I turned my back to the corner and sank to the floor of the intake office. They told me to go home to California, but I refused. I stayed at the Ronald McDonald House, and I found some friends to watch my youngest when I went on daily visits to see my son. My girls went home with my sister, and I would buy Lego sets from Target to build with him, and I would take it to him, and I prayed for him, and I prayed for healing, but I received more fire. I actually do want to add that I had a conversation with my son recently, this is much years later, and he said, "Mom, I didn't realize how expensive Legos were." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah." He's like, "When you were in Reno and you brought me those Legos all the time, that must have cost a lot of money." He remembered the Legos. Not that I put him in a locked facility, which I'm going to go with, you know. I was like, yes, Legos were very expensive. I was very poor. The doctor at the facility diagnosed my son with reactive attachment disorder. You'd think that added way more fuel to the fire. He wasn't safe to return home, but the insurance would not cover out-of-home care for children with reactive attachment disorder. So he needed to go home and go home now without any treatment, and I owed the facility over $3,000. I was defeated. How can I take this child home? How can I raise him and keep my other child safe? And I begged for help at from the therapist at the center. And he responded by saying, "Well, you only have one sick child. Your other ones are healthy. You should be okay." There was no need for tears, and no one was listening, but maybe they were, but they had no answer, so they blamed me. You need to be stronger. You need to be firmer. You need to be softer. You need to love more and discipline less. You need more structure. You need to let him, this is my favorite, you need to let him run on grass. Okay. He needs more medication. Only lazy and incompetent parents drug their children. God doesn't love you. Matthew's voice was louder than ever before. I brought my son home to Fresno, and within a few short days, we had an incident. It was actually right after this, first of these. I asked him to return a balloon back to his brother, and instantly he reached up, grabbed my hair, and pulled it with all of his might. My head was thrown back, and I could no longer see the road, so I slammed on my brakes. And I tried to release his grip, and I couldn't. He was starting to try to move his hands towards my eyes, and in desperation, I pulled his hand forward and I bit him, and he released his grip. I pulled into the parking lot. I threw him out of the car. He stood about 3 feet away staring at me. I sat outside the car protecting my 3 other children, and I couldn't go on like this as a single parent. My brother-in-law and sister took him home. I took the rest of my children home, and I called my parents because I knew I was going to have to move there. I didn't want to believe that this fire had taken me away from the church family and the people who showed me Christ's love when I had nothing. You guys are really lucky to be here. I didn't write this down, but when I was a single mom on Christmas, someone handed me $300 in an envelope, and that was everything. There was a time where we all got the flu, and there was vomit everywhere, and I couldn't leave the house because you're a single mom. And Eve's mom brought me Gatorade and Resolve, and I didn't know how I was going to survive without them. I left my apartment, moved into my parents' living room, and began to seek treatment for my son at the Attachment and Trauma Center in Sacramento. I remember the first time I called C. Eshelman, and I explained my son. I had a son, and his behaviors were spinning out of control, and he just been released for locked facility. And what I said, though, is I can't hear that it's my fault anymore. I just can't take it. And I think that was the first moment I truly spoke out my fear. It was my fault, and God doesn't love me. She asked me to repeat myself. I said, please don't tell me it's my fault. Even if it's true, I can't take it. And she responded by saying, no, sweetie, we don't do that here. C. Eshelman offers an online support group for a small fee to help families thrive. She doesn't say love heals all things, but she does say love matters. She wrote a book called Drowning with Your Hair on Fire. She's raised adopted kids, and she's fearless. She was able to put my son's behavior in perspective. She addressed my hurt, and she put both of us in therapy, and we were to heal together. She got my son to demonstrate some of his behaviors in session, which I don't know if any of you struggle with that. Like they're perfect when, they're out and then they get home and they're having meltdowns and it's hard to describe their behavior. So it was really great that she was able to do that, and then I could watch her deal with the behaviors. And she gave me a small flame of hope. And for a few reasons, I couldn't continue with C, but I had a new set of tools and I was braver. She told me the truth, and I really want you guys to know this, that our mental health system is broken. And the way we deal with broken people is broken. And she encouraged me to say goodbye to unhelpful workers and demand the best for my son. She taught me to forgive him and to forgive myself. But things weren't back to normal. My oldest son's behaviors continued to be volatile, so volatile at times. His behavior was volatile, and so were my responses. One day he went after my daughters, and he charged them down the hall, and I saw them holding each other, and they were terrified, and honestly, my reflexes took over. And I slammed the door, and all I could see is red. My motherly instinct to protect my children grabbed hold of me, and I attacked my own child. I slapped him across the face with all my might, and he came at me again. And I slapped him again, and blood poured down his face and his nose, and I was screaming, "You have to stop hurting people!" And he ran to the kitchen, and I slapped him again. And he curled into a ball. "I know, Mom, but you have to stop hurting me." And then the red began to disappear, and I was shocked at what happened. I am not excusing my behavior. I want to make that very clear. But there was no thought in what happened. We were both just so traumatized that we were just reacting. I wasn't trying to discipline him. I just needed help. And I called his psychologist immediately, and I told him myself, and I said, "We need help." I cannot tell you how many times I said, "We need help." And they told me they were going to call CPS if I do it again. I said, "Okay, send CPS, see if anyone else wants them." And the anger rose. Of course, they didn't. And of course, I didn't want to do it again. I was kind of insulted that if I was to call and tell myself that there was an expectation that I would ever want to do that again. If you have a child that's too violent, you can't get respite. I called his county of origin and requested additional in-home care, and they said that wasn't possible. So I asked them when their office opened, and I will drop him off. And then they said, you can have additional in-home care. The support came in the form of a bouncing college student who was bright-eyed and as brave as I was 10 years prior. And she told me about how structure was important and positive praise was key. And she told me love would fix everything. And I said, get out. I did not need parenting one-on-one. I knew how to make a behavior chart. He spit on my behavior chart and he pooped on my prizes. I needed more. And luckily, God brought me more. He brought me Rui. Rui is a quiet, hard worker. And he's rough around the edges. And he's bullheaded. And he's determined not to lose. And even more determined to love God. And he was not what any good adoption book would recommend. But he worked. He brought a level of control and balance to the family. He helped me heal. And in turn, my kids started listening to me. He prayed with me every night. And we fell in love. And before things got too crazy, I got him to marry me. And on my honeymoon, I was pregnant. But blending our family sucked. He had a crazy past with a crazy ex who showed up at our house yelling and screaming until the cops came, and so we moved. My eldest daughter was not interested in her new father. She still wanted Matthew. She was angry. My oldest son submitted to a new force who was stronger than him, but I knew his obedience would not last forever. And before anyone tells me that blending our families was probably a bad idea, I would agree, but God didn't. I don't know how God makes these impossible things possible, but he does. When I met Rui, I knew God saved him for me, and I knew that we were to walk alongside each other, but I understood better than him that this meant that we were both going to walk through a fire. Things began to stabilize more with the coming child. They loved her. In fact, I've had 3 children biologically with Rui, just because I can't work with social workers anymore. And every time we bring a new child, I see a level of healing that goes on with my kids. I became a stay-at-home mom again, and that helped, and I liked being at home. I liked meeting the needs of my family. Matthew, my ex, was sent to prison for sleeping with underage girls. And my oldest daughter gave up hope of reuniting. And by the way, just sweet justice, he received 6 years in prison, which is the same number of years that he took from me. He only served 3, though, so that's not quite fair. Even though things were not normal, they were bearable. It was hard watching Rui realize that his mere presence, commitment, and love were not enough to change the hearts that were so wounded. The process was going to take longer than a Hallmark movie would lead us to believe, and the changes seemed so small considering the sizes of the setback. When baby number 2 was born, my eldest was sliding headlong into a mental health breakdown. I could see it coming. His behavior at school was deteriorating. He was becoming obsessive at home. He was getting more volatile and violent every day. His hormones were changing faster than his medication. And once again, I cried out for help. After an incident where he hit my pregnant belly, and he flew into a rage, and for the first time, Rui had to restrain him, and we just knew we were in trouble. A whole nother story, CPS was called out to our house, and they interviewed us and then the children. And after they interviewed our oldest son, they asked to speak with us outside. And I expected to hear that all our children were going to be taken away from us until further investigation. And she looked at me and my husband and said, "Your son is sick. He is dangerous, and I think he might kill you in your sleep. You need to keep your other children safe." Then she left. They required us, I'm not kidding. They required us to make a safety plan, and that was it. Nothing else. A few days later, I was on my knees begging the Lord to free my son and our family from mental illness, and then he spoke to me again. It was the same stillness as before, the same clarity and certainty. It was the Lord's voice. But once again, the voice was not kind or gentle. It was matter of fact. Do not disdain your suffering. The next day, everything came to a head. My son was upset. I met with his teacher without his permission, and he began to rage. We followed our safety plan, and when he refused to leave the house, he was forcibly removed. And I was able to do this while remaining calm. No unnecessary force was used, but I began to weep. I didn't know what to do. I called the sheriff per our safety plan, in order for the sheriff to assess whether or not he was safe enough to come home. And he got quiet, and I heard him call out, "Mom, I need a towel." "Why do you need a towel?" "Because I'm bleeding." "Why are you bleeding?" "Because you threw me into the wall." "What? I did not." I had no idea what he was talking about. Yes, you did." And the sheriff showed up. My son had gone to the backyard attempting to find his way back to the house. CPS was already on the phone with me and talking to the sheriff. My son came out from the backyard. Blood covered his face, his neck, and dripped down his shirt. There was so much blood, and I was so confused. I went inside. I called my husband. He told me to check the cameras, and I did. There was footage in front of me, and the video was of my son. He grabbed a shoe and repeatedly smashed into his face over and over again until blood came out of his nose. He stopped, felt the blood, and walked outside. By now, there were a number of sheriffs at my house. I showed them the footage, and it was shocking even to them. I curled in my bed, on my bed until my husband came and said, "I need your help." My son was taken to the hospital for a 5150 evaluation. He didn't know that I had a video of him hitting himself. He was scheduled to go to Bakersfield Psychiatric Hospital at 6:30 a.m., and I wanted to see him before he left. I wanted to ask him one question. Why? Why did you say that I did that to you? "Because you did," he replied, looking at me right in the eyes. I told him that is a lie. He said that I was a liar. And I told him I had a video of him with the shoe. And at that point, he turned away from me and I left the room. I want to tell you that I loved my son when I left that room. I want to say that I had hope, but I didn't. I want to say that I knew God was going to see me through it, but I didn't. I wanted to say that God spoke to me again and told me to trust him, but he didn't speak, and I was done. For the safety of my children, I was done. For my marriage, I was done. For myself, I was done. And I didn't even bother to ask God if he was done. I stopped reading books, going to support groups, and looking for adoption answers. I stopped trying to better myself. I stopped talking about God. I wasn't done with my faith, but I was done with trying to be enough. I was done trying to find the perfect answers or the magical solution. I was done trying to make the world a better place. All I wanted to do was survive until my son's 18th birthday without losing my children or going to jail. I would walk across this desert, but I would do it with my heart harder. I really didn't want to work with God or his redemptive process anymore. I was afraid it was going to cost too much. I can't tell you in any words that does justice what this experience was like. CPS called and said if I don't find out-of-home placement and he hurts anyone, they were going to take away my other children. Did they offer me out-of-home placement? No. His adoption worker from his county of origin told me that if I dissolved my adoption to him, they would charge me with child abandonment, and all my children would be taken away from me. They told me they would hold me financially responsible for him and all of his medical care. And I called C. Eshelman, and I asked her what to do, and she agreed my son was unsafe to come home, but I shouldn't dissolve the adoption because the state would bankrupt me for his care and then bankrupt me again. She said she's seen it happen. Our system is so broken, and we really do need to start talking about that. We really do need to start talking about helping these kids, finding them real help, and stop blaming the people who are walking alongside of them. I didn't want to give up hope, and I didn't want to fail. I didn't want this to be my story, and I didn't want to be his mom. They didn't have ribbons for families of psychotic children. They don't have respite care services or walkathons or science or research. They had fingers to point and threats to make, but it didn't matter how upset or mad they were. My son was still sick, my family was still hurt, and I was still furious. I was boxed into a corner, and I felt there were no answers. I had 6 other children at home, including a 4-week-old baby, and everyone was passing the buck. My husband and I made a plan for me to return to work and for him to stay at home with the children. He could keep everyone safer. I stopped asking permission, and I started demanding solutions. I knew if he went into a group home in the 5th grade, he would most likely return before he was 18, so I decided to keep his care under my control. The cold, hard truth is that no one cared about his outcomes more than me. And if not for him, I was going to help him, it was for the rest of us. He had a good teacher and a psychiatrist, so I found a group home near me that was contracted with a psychiatrist and willing to transport him to his school, so I moved him there. But I still prayed for his healing every night. I was still obedient to God, and I read one final book, Philip Yancey's Disappointment with God, and I'm glad I did. It gave me some truth that I needed to realize as I retreated from the world. The first truth is that God had some pretty rotten children of his own. He had rescued the Israelites from slavery. He provided them mercy and miracles, and they still rejected him. Maybe perfect parenting didn't make perfect children. And the second thing I learned is sometimes we suffer for no good reason, and sometimes that pain is too great. Sometimes we perish before making it to the promised land. Watching my son suffer felt senseless and deeply affected my relationship with God. I didn't understand how a good God allowed children to suffer in horrific ways. The typical responses about sanctification and purification fell short. But for some reason, I trusted God, and I was silent, and I waited for answers. I'm going to give you the good news before I go in. As the next 3 years moved on, my son slowly began to heal. I do not know how. I do not know why. Maybe it was prayer. That's a good answer. Today he sleeps in the same room. He sleeps in the room under my same roof. He has a 4.0 GPA, and we continue to sleep with our doors locked. His psychiatrist sat him down and told him he was a miracle. People don't come out of his situations and return home successfully. In all of his years of working with kids as sick as he was, no one had seen, he had only ever seen one child recover. One. But the greater miracle is that my anger slowly rescinded. Slowly my ability to laugh with him and live with him returned, and so did joy. And I believe the same could be said of him. And honestly, I don't know why. I think God has a plan that sometimes we don't understand. And that's okay. Somewhere along the line, about a year ago, the Lord called to me again. Once again, it was not a call of comfort, but it was a call of action. Rebecca, you need to engage with me again. And he began to reveal some truth for me. Through my stillness and lack of striving, my heart slowly softened, and I received some much-needed truth. The truth of who he is and how much he loves me. And today I am closer to my Creator. And this time I came to him calmer and stronger, and I'm ready for fire. Pain, suffering, and triumph are not unique to Christians, but Christ's sacrifice is. I learned many things because of the fires. Because of my trials, I began to speak more truth. I no longer idolized peace. I wanted truth, healing, and passion. I was not afraid of loss. I had already lost. Peace comes and goes. Pain and joy are transitory. Pain and suffering is guaranteed as long as we live on earth, whether we are Christian, Buddhist, atheist, or nothing. But knowing our lives contribute to the redemption of all creation is our gift. Success is not the goal of the disciple, but speaking about God's love is. The fact that the God of all creation came down to speak into my life was a miracle. And he loves me. Why? Because he is love. I learned that the gift of grief and disappointment is not what I was told. It is not recovering what is lost. It is not thriving in spite of challenges. When God told me he was going to put me in a fire, or I was going to go through a fire, he was not telling me he was going to put me in a trial. He was telling me he was going to turn me into a vessel. He was telling me he was going to allow me to participate in his redemptive work. I get to walk alongside children who are suffering and families in pain. And in doing so, I am going to get hurt. But I also get to walk alongside my Savior. And that's my speech. I had more, but I just really feel like it doesn't matter if your children get better. I mean, we all want it, and that is important, and I'm not trying to minimize any pain. But what matters is that we're faithful to God, that we're faithful to his calling, that we love even when it seems like it's not working. We don't know why it's going to work. I will honestly say that my son's healing may just be due to his intelligence. I mean, I'm not magic. And some of my children are really suffering, and I couldn't even get into their stories still. But the truth is, God loves us no matter what, and he's there for us. And the greatest gift is that, one day we get to see him and know that we got to help and be part of the work he had for this earth. And that when we see the new earth, we were part of that, and he cared enough to call us to work alongside of him. So that's it. If you have any questions, I'm totally always available. If Jason gives you my phone number, please call me. I love to help. I love to encourage families to advocate for their kids and help build services. So that's it. All right. Yes. Yeah, I'll take questions. Sorry. I don't know how to. Mm-hmm. Work. Yeah, there's a really good book called Beyond Logic, Consequences, and Control. I'm saying it wrong, but we really don't know what's going on in the inner heart of anyone. So if you really feel called to minister to someone in a certain way, whether or not you see the results, my advice is to do that. If you, of course, always fixing is not what we do. That's what God does. So what I tell myself when I'm in those situations, and I feel very similar to you, is that if God has called me to treat my child a certain way, if I have a piece of information that will help him, and I try it, I'm going to do it because I need to be obedient to him. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and I can be released from the guilt of it not working. And that's kind of, I think there's a lot of guilt that gets put on parents when their kids struggle, and I think the best thing is to be relieved from that, because it'll release a lot of the control that we try to have over our kids that isn't helpful. Yeah. So. Yep. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is very hard. And honestly, what I'm going to tell you is there's probably not an easy answer for that. And I think I guess as a teacher, I'll tell you. No, what I would honestly say in that situation is just do what you can. You can't control. The whole thing is you can have these boundaries. You have these rules in place, and those are good. I say that kids are not like dogs. We're not Cesar Chavez, like having magic skills. Our children are like plants, and we need to create an environment and a soil and a place that's nice and rich for them to grow. But we don't need. But really, when we do some trimming here and there, but ultimately they are what they are. And the only person that can in the long term alter that is God, if he so wants to. But the chances are he gave them that seedling for a purpose. He made them that for a purpose. And that purpose may go beyond, their healing may be beyond when they're with me. And accepting that is one thing I've had to do with one of my oldest. Her healing is going to have to take place after me. And that's hard, but I have hope that that's actually going to happen. So, yes. I don't know what time it is. So, 5 minutes. Any other questions? So, yeah. I hope I didn't depress anyone, because I really do love my children, and I really wouldn't exchange this journey for anything. So, anyways. All right. All right.
Hey, Rebecca, can you do this for us? Can you pray over us as a group? And I know many of us are on different phases of the journey, and some of us are in the green pastures, and some of us are in the wasteland right now, and just different parts of the path. And I just would love it if you would just pray over the group and wherever we are in our journey, and that we would feel the presence of God in that spot, right?
Dear God, you know our hearts and you love us. You know where we're at, and you're there with us. When we weep, when we're lost, when we don't know what to do, Lord, you do, but you also weep alongside of us. And I just pray, Lord, that we can find you, that we can take comfort in what you've created and what you are creating. I pray, Lord, that you provide the resources that are needed, the love that is needed, whatever is needed for these families to thrive. I pray, Lord, that you give them courage and wisdom to know what to do when things are hard. Give them peace to know, Lord, that you will direct their paths and that you are in ultimate control of everything, including the healing of their child. And Lord, let us not be discouraged by suffering, because we suffer right alongside of you. And I pray, Lord, that we realize that we will come and see the fruits of our labor someday. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, it is that time, so let's go ahead and go and grab our kiddos. Can you hang around for a little longer? Okay, so she will be here, so if anybody wants to come and talk with her and chat a little bit, she'll be here as long as needed. As long as needed. Look at there. Yeah, she's child-free. So God bless you all. Thank you guys so much for being here. We look forward to next month's group. All right, now I'm going to confuse everybody. It's almost always the last Thursday of the month. Next month, it's the fourth Thursday of the month. Okay? So then we'll get back on the last Thursday of the month, even if there's a fifth. But we're going out of town the last, so I figured it's a little early to cut and run, So since we haven't seen y'all in a year. So anyway, so next month, the fourth Thursday of the month. All right, God bless you all. Grab your kiddos. Feel free to hang around as long as you want. Just keep your eyeballs on your kids.